The rain in Seattle always had a way of washing away the truth. It masked the tears, hid the footprints, and drowned out the sound of a breaking heart. For months, I thought the storm was my fault. I thought the darkness consuming my mind was just the natural weight of grief. My husband, Julian, was always there. He was the perfect silhouette against the window, pouring me another drink, whispering that the pain would eventually fade. He played the role of the devoted savior flawlessly, but the devil rarely wears horns. Sometimes he wears a tailored Italian suit and carries a crystal glass of bourbon. He thought he was slowly burying me alive. He had no idea I was the one digging his grave. My life was a study in extreme contrasts. I was born in a rotting trailer in the damp, decaying logging town of Oakhaven. My biological mother, Sarah, was a woman completely consumed by her addictions. She had a new child every year, each one a product of a fleeting, desperate romance. But my father was different. Richard was a young, ambitious timber magnate who got stranded in Oakhaven for one rainy night. When he found out about me years later, he came back. He found me running barefoot in the snow, shivering and hungry. He took me away, raised me in a Seattle mansion of glass and steel, and gave me the world. His wife, Eleanor, became the only true mother I ever knew. I inherited an empire, married a handsome executive named Julian, and seemingly had it all. But true shadows are born in the brightest light. My only sorrow was my inability to have children. I thought it was the greatest tragedy of my life. I was painfully wrong. The real tragedy was sleeping right next to me. The eerie howling of a stray dog echoed through the mist-shrouded pines of Oakhaven. The locals always said that when the stray dogs howled like that, the Grim Reaper was walking down their cracked asphalt roads. They were right. The next morning, the town buzzed with the morbid news. Sarah was dead. My biological mother had finally succumbed to the poison she had poured into her veins for 40 years. She was found cold and rigid on the stained linoleum floor of her trailer. I was standing in my sunlit Seattle penthouse when the call came. The contrast was physically nauseating. I stood there, wrapped in a pure silk robe, holding a cup of artisan coffee, listening to a stranger tell me that the woman who gave me life had died in absolute squalor. I didn't cry. My father had taught me duty, not empty sentimentality. I arranged everything from 300 miles away. The funeral was a bleak, miserable affair. The graveyard was a patch of uneven dirt surrounded by rusting chain-link fences. The local women huddled in tight circles, their eyes darting toward me. I stood at the edge of the grave in a tailored black designer coat, holding a heavy black umbrella. I felt like an alien on a hostile planet. The whispers drifted over the cold wind. They muttered about the apple not falling far from the tree. They wondered if the rich city girl had the same rotten core as her mother. I paid the undertaker in cash, thanked the few people who showed up, and walked away. I owed Sarah a decent burial, but I owed her nothing else. Before leaving town, I felt a strange, morbid pull. I drove my luxury SUV down the muddy road to the trailer park. I needed to see where my story began. I needed to look the ghost of my past directly in the eyes. The door to the trailer groaned on rusted hinges as I pushed it open. The smell hit me instantly. It was a suffocating cocktail of stale cigarettes, sour liquor, and rotting wood. I stepped inside, my expensive leather boots crunching over broken glass and discarded wrappers. The walls were peeling, revealing the damp insulation underneath. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 3 years old again. I remembered cutting my foot on a broken bottle by the lake. I remembered running to my mother, crying for comfort. Instead, she had slapped the back of my head, laughing with whatever strange man was sitting on the torn sofa. The memory sent a violent shiver down my spine. I hurried out of the trailer, gasping for the crisp pine air. I gripped the steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. I was so incredibly lucky. If my father hadn't come for me, I would have died in that very room. Driving back to the city, my mind drifted to the rumours I had heard at the graveyard. The locals mentioned Sarah's other children, my half-siblings. They were scattered across the state foster care system. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I had grown up in the lap of luxury, surrounded by love, while they were trapped in the nightmare I had escaped. I could not just drive away. I rerouted my GPS to the County Child Services office. The building was a grim, cinder-block structure that smelled of bleach and despair. The social worker sat behind a desk piled high with tragic files. When I asked about Sarah's children, her eyes widened. There were 7 of them. The oldest was 16, the youngest just 2 years old. 7 children, bouncing from group homes to temporary foster families. My heart physically ached. I had to see them. They brought the 2 oldest teenagers into a sterile visiting room. Haley was 15, and Tyler was 17. When they walked in, the breath caught in my throat. Haley had the exact same green eyes as me. Tyler had my jawline. They stood near the door, defensive, their arms crossed over their faded hoodies. They knew our mother was dead, and they looked at me with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. I did not offer them empty condolences. I offered them truth. I told them who I was. I told them about my father. I reached into my purse, handed them cash, and gave them my gold-embossed business card. I promised them that when they aged out of the system, I would be waiting. I promised to pay for their education and help them build a life. Tyler looked at the card, his tough exterior cracking just a fraction. Haley wiped a stray tear from her cheek. I left that room with a fierce new purpose. When I returned to my pristine Seattle mansion, the air felt instantly colder. My husband, Julian, was sitting by the modern gas fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. I told him everything. I poured out my emotions, telling him about the trailer, the funeral, and my siblings. Julian's handsome face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. He took a slow sip of his drink and sighed. He told me I was being overly emotional. He warned me that these foster kids were essentially parasites. He said they would drain my bank accounts and ruin our perfect social standing. His words felt like physical slaps. I stared at the man I loved, searching for an ounce of empathy in his dark eyes. There was none. He saw my blood as a liability. That night, I turned my back to him in our massive king-sized bed. A small, cold fracture had opened in the foundation of our perfect marriage. Months passed, and the tension in our home grew thicker. My desire to adopt my younger siblings became an obsession, fueled by my own devastating medical reality. The fertility clinics were all the same. Blindingly white rooms, soft instrumental music, and doctors with apologetic smiles. The diagnosis was absolute. I would never carry a child. I felt like a broken vessel. Julian played the part of the supportive husband in public. He held my hand in the waiting rooms. But in private, he dismissed my pain. When I suggested we adopt Haley and Tyler, he exploded. He yelled that he wanted an heir, not someone else's genetic mistakes. The arguments grew bitter and loud. I sought comfort in my parents. My father, Richard, and my stepmother, Eleanor, were my sanctuary. They listened, they held me, and they told me to follow my heart. They were the only light in my increasingly dark world. The anniversary gala at my parents' estate was a breathtaking display of wealth and love. The manicured gardens were strung with thousands of fairy lights. A string quartet played softly near the fountain. My father wore a classic tuxedo, and Eleanor looked stunning in a midnight blue gown. They spun around the marble dance floor, lost in each other's eyes. Julian stood by my side, playing the charismatic son-in-law to absolute perfection. He charmed the investors, laughed at the right moments, and kissed my cheek for the photographers. It was a flawless illusion. Late that night, after the guests had departed, we sat on the terrace overlooking the lake. The air was warm and smelled of blooming jasmine. My father hugged me tight, kissing the top of my head. It was a moment of absolute peace. I had no idea it was the very last time I would ever feel his embrace. The next morning shattered that peace forever. The Seattle rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, battering against the glass walls of our home. The phone rang sharply at 7 in the morning. It was Julian's executive secretary, Chloe. Her voice was frantic. She claimed there was a massive server failure at the corporate headquarters. Millions of dollars in data were supposedly vanishing. My father, always the fierce protector of his empire, did not hesitate. He grabbed his coat and his car keys. I tried to wake Julian, but he groaned, clutching his head, complaining of a severe hangover from the gala. He refused to get out of bed. My father kissed Eleanor goodbye and rushed out into the storm. I watched his black luxury sedan disappear into the grey mist. The house fell completely silent. Only the rhythmic drumming of the rain remained. An hour passed, then 2. The silence began to feel like a tightening noose. The shrill ring of my cell phone cut through the quiet. The caller ID showed an unknown number. My heart skipped a violent beat. When I answered, a deep, professional voice introduced himself as a state highway patrol officer. He asked to confirm my identity. Then, he delivered the words that stopped time. There had been a massive collision on the wet coastal highway. A dark SUV had swerved aggressively, forcing my parents' car off the road. The vehicle had rolled multiple times down a steep embankment. The officer paused. The silence on the line was deafening. He told me there were no survivors. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The world collapsed into a singular point of unbearable agony. My legs gave out. I fell to the floor, screaming until my vocal cords tore. Julian rushed out of the bedroom, his face a mask of shock. He wrapped his arms around me, but I was already gone. The double funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and relentless freezing rain. 2 polished mahogany caskets sat above the dark, muddy earth. The entire city elite had gathered to pay their respects. I stood at the edge of the abyss, completely hollowed out. Julian stood right beside me. He held me tight against his chest. He wiped the rain from my cheeks. He accepted the condolences from the board members with solemn grace. But as I leaned against him, I felt a strange stiffness in his posture. There was no real warmth in his touch. Julian's parents, Arthur and Beatrice, had flown in from Europe. They stood a few feet away. I caught Beatrice looking at the massive estate in the background. Her eyes were not filled with sorrow. They were filled with calculation. She looked like a predator sizing up a fresh kill. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Julian convinced me that we needed to move into my parents' massive estate. He claimed it was to protect the property, but the moment we moved in, the atmosphere changed. The house felt cavernous and hostile. Julian's parents practically moved in with us. Arthur and Beatrice paced the mahogany hallways, loudly discussing which walls to tear down and how they would redesign the gardens. They acted as if the tragedy was a real estate opportunity. When I locked myself in my father's old study, sobbing over his leather chair, Julian followed me. He didn't offer a hug. He offered a heavy crystal tumbler filled with expensive bourbon. He spoke in a soft, hypnotic tone. He told me that grief was a monster that needed to be subdued. He told me to drink. I hated the taste, but the alcohol burned a path of numbness through my chest. I drank it. Then he poured me another. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks blurred into an amber-coloured haze. I stopped returning calls from the corporate board. I stopped caring about the world outside the estate gates. Whenever the crushing weight of reality tried to surface, Julian was there. He always had a fresh bottle. He always had a glass ready. I did not realise what he was doing. I did not realise he was weaponizing the very genetics that had killed my biological mother. My blood was primed for addiction, and Julian was feeding the demon with a silver spoon. While I lay in a stupor on the velvet couches, Julian took absolute control of my father's company. He forged my signature. He moved millions of dollars across international accounts. He fired my father's most loyal executives. I was fading into a ghost in my own home, exactly as he planned. One evening, the heavy oak doors of the mansion burst open. The security guards were shouting, but a young woman pushed violently past them. It was Haley. She was soaking wet from the rain, her eyes blazing with fury. The maid tried to stop her, but Haley shoved her aside and marched straight into the grand living room. I was lying on the Persian rug, clutching a half-empty bottle of gin. Haley stared at me, her chest heaving. The disappointment in her green eyes was worse than any physical blow. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and dragged me across the floor. She hauled me into the marble bathroom and pushed me fully clothed into the massive glass shower. She turned the cold water on full blast. The freezing shock hit me like a freight train. I gasped, coughing and thrashing, but she held me down. The icy water shocked the alcohol from my system. I sat on the wet marble floor, shivering uncontrollably. Haley knelt beside me, the fury in her eyes shifting to desperate urgency. She told me she had graduated from her nursing program. She was working at the premier private maternity clinic downtown. Yesterday, she saw a patient arrive for a high-profile ultrasound. The patient was Chloe, Julian's personal secretary. But she wasn't alone. Julian was with her. Haley described how Julian held Chloe's hand. She described how he kissed her stomach and whispered about their future son. The words echoed off the cold tile walls. My mind, clouded by weeks of alcohol, suddenly snapped into razor-sharp focus. The betrayal was not just emotional. It was systemic. Julian was building a new family while systematically destroying me. I stayed on the bathroom floor long after Haley left. The cold had seeped into my bones, but the fire igniting in my chest was blinding. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly locked together with terrifying clarity. Julian had known about my mother's addiction. He had purposely pushed the alcohol on me. He wanted me declared incompetent. He wanted to lock me in an asylum and take absolute control of the empire for his new family. The grief that had paralyzed me instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I was my father's daughter. I was a survivor. I stood up, stripped off my wet clothes, and dried myself. I stared at my pale, hollow reflection in the mirror. The victim was dead. When I walked back into the living room, I kicked the empty gin bottle under the sofa. The hunt had begun. When Julian returned home that night, he found me sprawled on the sofa, seemingly unconscious. I had rubbed whiskey on my neck and spilled a little on my blouse to complete the illusion. I kept my breathing slow and rhythmic. Julian walked into the room, his leather shoes clicking against the hard wood. He stood over me for a long moment. I could feel his stare. He let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. He didn't even bother leaving the room. He spoke directly to his father, Arthur. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs as I listened to the monstrous truth. Julian bragged about how easy it was. He confirmed that the documents were almost ready. He laughed about how the drunken heiress would soon be locked away, securing their financial future forever. The next morning, Julian left for the corporate headquarters, wearing one of my father's custom suits. As soon as his car cleared the main gates, I sprang into action. I poured all the expensive liquor down the kitchen sink and replaced it with cold, dark tea. If he wanted to play a game of deception, I would rewrite the rules. I found a hidden burner phone in my father's old desk and dialed the only person left in the world I could trust. My half-brother, Tyler. Tyler had grown into a tough, street-smart mechanic. I told him I needed his help, no questions asked. Within an hour, Tyler's beat-up, rusted Ford pickup truck was idling in the service alley behind the mansion. I slipped out through the kitchen, wearing dark sunglasses and a thick trench coat. I climbed into the cab, the smell of motor oil and old leather offering a strange sense of safety. Tyler drove us downtown, blending perfectly into the heavy Seattle traffic. We parked across the street from my own company's towering glass skyscraper. We sat in the damp truck for hours, eating stale diner food, watching the main entrance. Finally, Julian emerged. He wasn't alone. Chloe was walking beside him. Her designer coat was unbuttoned, clearly revealing the swell of her pregnant belly. Julian placed a protective hand on the small of her back. They looked like a picture-perfect couple. Tyler gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in anger. He offered to get out and break Julian's jaw right there. I placed a hand on his arm and shook my head. Violence was too cheap. I wanted to take everything from him. We tailed Julian's sleek, black Mercedes through the city streets. He drove directly to an ultra-luxury condo building. It was a property that belonged to me. Julian had moved his pregnant mistress into my own penthouse suite. The audacity was almost poetic. Tyler drove me away from the agonizing scene, navigating through the industrial district. He pulled up to a dingy brick building with a flickering neon sign. Tyler explained that he knew a man, a former police detective who got pushed off the force for refusing to take a bribe from a corrupt politician. His name was Cole. We walked up the creaking wooden stairs to Cole's office. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Cole was a large, rugged man with sharp, assessing eyes. He didn't look at my expensive coat or my messy hair. He looked right into my soul. I laid the entire story on his scarred wooden desk. I told him about the accident, the drinking, the mistress, and the money. Cole leaned back, lit a cigarette, and simply nodded. "Let's tear him down," he said. For the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the tragic, broken drunk flawlessly. I drank my iced tea from crystal tumblers, slurred my words, and passed out before Julian came home. Meanwhile, Cole was a ghost moving through the city's underbelly. He was brilliant. The first bombshell he dropped on my desk was a massive financial dossier. Julian's parents, Arthur and Beatrice, were completely bankrupt. Their European business was a total fraud, drowning in millions of dollars of debt. They had fled to America to avoid federal prison. Julian was their only lifeline. But Cole didn't stop there. He started digging into the morning of my parents' crash. The official report blamed the wet roads and the other driver. But Cole found the black box data. He found the impound lot. He found the terrifying mechanical truth that the police had conveniently overlooked. We met in a dark corner booth of an all-night diner. Cole pushed a manila folder across a sticky table. His face was grim. He explained that my father's car had not simply lost control. The brake lines had been expertly tampered with. It was a delayed release cut, designed to fail under heavy pressure, like swerving on a wet highway. Cole had tracked down the mechanic. The man was a low-level enforcer connected to an underground gambling ring. A ring where Arthur owed a massive debt. Julian had brokered a deal. The mechanic sabotaged the car to erase Arthur's debt, knowing Julian would inherit the empire and pay out a massive bonus. I stared at the blurry photographs in the file. My vision tunneled. I couldn't breathe. My husband had ordered the execution of my parents. The betrayal sliced through my chest like a jagged piece of glass. I returned to the mansion that evening. The storm outside matched the violent tempest in my soul. Julian was waiting in the grand study. He was pacing, agitated, holding a thick stack of legal documents. When I stumbled into the room, playing my drunken part, he pounced. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip painfully tight. He pushed me into the leather chair and slammed a pen onto the desk. The documents were absolute, a complete transfer of power of attorney and asset ownership. He spoke to me like a child. He told me I was too sick to manage my father's legacy. He told me I needed to sign it all over so I could go to a special clinic to rest. His eyes were wild with greed. The mask had completely slipped. I looked at the papers, my heart pounding in my throat. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled, but not from alcohol. Instead of signing, I grabbed the heavy marble inkwell and smashed it across the desk. The black ink exploded, shattering over Julian's crisp white shirt. He recoiled in shock, swearing loudly. I lunged forward, grabbed the original legal documents, and bolted toward the terrace doors. I threw them open and ran into the pouring rain. Julian roared in absolute fury and chased after me. The muddy grass grabbed at my shoes, but pure adrenaline fueled my legs. I scrambled over the low stone wall at the edge of the property, tearing my coat on the briars. The dark highway stretched ahead. Headlights pierced the heavy rain. It was Cole's armored SUV. The tires screeched as he slammed on the brakes. I ripped open the passenger door and threw myself inside. Before Julian could reach the road, Cole floored the accelerator, leaving my husband standing in the rain. We didn't go into hiding. We went straight to the precinct. Cole had already forwarded his entire investigative file to a trusted federal prosecutor. The evidence was irrefutable. The financial wire transfers from the corporate accounts to the gambling syndicate. The testimony of the mechanic, who had flipped the moment the feds threatened him. The forged signatures. The tampered brake lines. I sat in a sterile interrogation room, wrapping a thermal blanket around my freezing shoulders, watching the monitors. Within 2 hours, tactical police units swarmed my father's estate. The body cam footage showed Julian screaming and demanding his lawyers as he was slammed against the hood of a squad car. Arthur and Beatrice were pulled from their luxury guest suites in handcuffs, their faces pale with terror. The empire they tried to steal had become their absolute ruin. The next morning, the city woke up to a massive scandal. The front pages of every newspaper detailed the horrific conspiracy. I stood in the lobby of my own luxury condo building, accompanied by Cole and 2 uniformed officers. We rode the private elevator up to the penthouse. When the doors opened, Chloe was standing there in a silk robe, sipping expensive orange juice. When she saw the police, her face drained of all colour. I stepped forward, my voice cold and steady. I told her everything. I told her Julian was facing a double homicide charge. I told her the bank accounts were frozen. I told her she was an accessory to the murder of my parents. The sheer terror of the revelation hit her physically. Chloe gasped, dropping her glass. It shattered on the marble floor. She clutched her swollen stomach and collapsed. The stress had triggered premature labour. The ambulance rushed her to the very hospital where Haley worked. I stood in the harsh, fluorescent light of the waiting room. Hours later, the doctor emerged. Chloe had delivered a healthy baby boy. But there was no joy in the maternity ward. When the police questioned Chloe about her involvement, she panicked completely. Knowing she was facing severe criminal charges and realizing her meal ticket was gone, she made a cold, calculated decision. She demanded a pen and paper. Right there in the hospital bed, she signed a total relinquishment of parental rights. She abandoned the child to the state, hoping a plea deal would save her from prison. I walked into the neonatal unit and looked through the glass. The tiny baby boy lay in the plastic crib, completely alone in the world. An innocent soul, born from a web of absolute evil. He had done nothing wrong. Months passed, and the heavy fog of the past slowly lifted. I purged the company of Julian's loyalists and promoted those who had remained true to my father's vision. Tyler left the auto shop and became the head of our corporate fleet logistics. Haley finished her nursing degree and took a lead position at a top paediatric clinic. The mansion was no longer a silent, echoing mausoleum. I bought a massive new property out in the rolling green hills, surrounded by massive oak trees and sunlight. The silence was replaced by chaos. Beautiful, loud, wonderful chaos. I had gone back to the County Child Services office. I didn't just sponsor my half-siblings. I formally adopted every single one of them. The house was filled with teenagers arguing over the television, little kids running through the hallways, and the smell of fresh baking from the kitchen. But my family was not quite complete. One quiet afternoon, Cole came to the house. Over the months of the investigation, our professional respect had deepened into something profound. He understood the darkest parts of my soul, and he loved the light that emerged from it. We sat on the massive wraparound porch. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a simple, beautiful diamond ring. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. But I had one condition. I told him about the baby boy left in the hospital, the child of the man who tried to destroy me. I told Cole that I couldn't leave him to the system. I couldn't let him grow up feeling unwanted. repeating the cycle of abandonment that my biological mother had started. Cole smiled, his rugged face softening. He kissed my forehead and told me that our house had plenty of room for one more crib. The summer breeze carried the scent of pine and blooming lavender. I stood on the patio, watching Cole push little Leo, Julian's son, on the wooden swing set. Haley and Tyler were chasing the younger kids across the lawn. The trauma of the past felt like a distant, fading nightmare. I had lost the parents who raised me, but I had built a fierce, unbreakable tribe from the ashes of their legacy. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me. I gripped the wooden railing. It was the same dizziness I had been feeling for 2 weeks. I went inside and retrieved the small plastic test I had hidden in the bathroom drawer. I stared at the 2 bright pink lines. The doctors had said it was physically impossible. They said I would never carry a child. But life, when finally nurtured with true love, finds a way. I placed my hand over my stomach. The tears that fell were finally, purely, tears of absolute joy. The darkness tried to consume my entire existence. The man I trusted with my heart tried to bury me under the weight of my own grief. But he underestimated the strength of a woman fighting for her family's legacy. He is rotting in a federal prison, while I am standing in the sunlight, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of the family I chose. Every scar I carry is a reminder that you can either let betrayal destroy you, or you can use it to build an empire. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be your worst enemy? Let me know your story in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more incredible true dramas, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up fighting.